I've noticed that if I open the presentation too early, it doesn't share properly. So we have to. Right. Okay. Can you see that? Yeah. Oh, thanks. Okay, Dan. Well, yeah. Good evening again to the Dragon Club, and my second talk to you. I've only got 2 talks, so this will be the end of it. They say you play every venue once on the way up and on the way down, so welcome to my second talk. And of course, Simon gave a talk to my club. I'm a member of Cray Valley Radio Society here in South London, which is one of the biggest clubs. I'm on the committee there, and it's a very big club. So we've been very busy in the lockdown as well. A little bit about me that you've already had anyway. I'm one of the youngest original call holders with a G3 call. They ran out in 1971 after running just after the war to the Z. And I was at school when I got G3ZPS. And then a few months after they ran out. Since I've been licensed, of course, and more in the recent years, they've reissued quite a few. So I meet a G3 on the air and I say, oh, that call sign dates from 1959. I wonder how old you are, and they say, oh no, it was my granddad's, or it was a friend, so I get caught out. So I've been working with old ham radio kit all the way through, more recently in the last few years since I've been retired, and I've got about 40 stations, I think, down the workshop of different types. In this talk, I cannot possibly cover all the different makes and all the interesting stuff of some of this old gear and why we bother with it. So if I miss something out and any of you have got a favourite bit of old gear and I don't mention it, it's not because I don't know about it or I've forgotten it, it's just we haven't got time to get it all in. So let's start with a bit of a health warning, really, because I don't know about many members of your club on the call, but this is a health warning. If you're quite happy with a shack that looks like this with your Icon 73 doodah and a laptop and a microphone and a nice pine table, then maybe you should pop out and make a cup of coffee now, because this could well frighten you. That isn't my garage, but you know, I've seen some radio hams garages that look almost as bad as this. And, whoop, somebody's muted there. Okay, it's been muted now. So there's a sort of worrying thing that can happen to you if you start playing with too much old kit. Greg's gone to the ham auction rally this afternoon to get rid of some old radios that were cluttering the place up. Oh, there he is coming back now out of ice shot, and Greg's come back with more radios than he took to the radio rally. And if you're really, really bad, I mean really, really bad, you could end up like George, W9 EVT. Now, this is one part of George's shack. If you, at the end of this presentation, go on to QRZ and type in W9 EVT. The pages keep on coming. And his outbuilding is bigger than my entire property and my garden and probably my neighbour's garden, his museum. It's just staggering. How he keeps it all going, I've got no idea. And what his electricity bill is, I've got no idea either. So we just to go back a little bit in time and whiz through, you know, where we came from with some of this stuff. Between the wars, between the First World War and the Second World War, those wonderful things called valves that are sort of disappearing now, and I meet a lot of people who don't really know what they are anymore. Some of you might know what they are. Valves, thermodynamic tubes, always the Americans catch me out with that. They were very basic at the end of the First World War, but just in that period between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, the whole characterization of every aspect of a thermodynamic valve and how they work and how they could be improved was just about resolved. An incredible amount of science was put into it, actually. And by the First World War, the radio valve was reached pretty much a pinnacle of development. They got smaller after the war, and specialist ones appeared, but all the main development was done in that period, and they're central to a lot of the gear that I play with and we're going to talk about. And that valve, I think I mentioned it in my last presentation, is the EF50, the valve that sort of helped win the war because it was in all the radar around the UK, the chain home radar. Separate story in itself if you're really interested. look up history of the year 50. It's an interest, not particularly technical, it's just an interesting story. So in the period between the wars, valve technology moved on very, very quickly, spurred on a lot of the time by broadcasting. Of course, 2LO in the early 20s took over here. In the Americas, it's US, it started a little bit earlier. But the big move was to get, when the BBC started, was to get radio into everybody's home. So broadcasting big transmitters and broadcast receivers was a big thing, and that's where a lot of development took place. Us radio hams, back in those days, for a very brief period, we had pretty much unlimited access to what we now know as the HF bands and top band onwards. But very, very quickly, when broadcasters and military realised how useful they were and how they really worked, we were stuffed into the bands, not exactly like we have now, top band 80, 40, 20, 15 and 10, but we were compartmentalised. So just around 1922, smart transmitters and the valve was taking over and was available for amateurs and in broadcast radios. And before that, of course, it was spark transmitters a lot of the time, not entirely. And that's from the American magazine when 1922, 21, 22, in fact, it's 100 years this year, when radio hams spanned the Atlantic. And there's the valve having beaten the spark transmitter into submission, and the valve leaning on the ropes. So although there's a huge impact in this country of broadcast radio for the old radio valve, there wasn't much off-the-shelf ham gear at all, even into the 30s. Very, very little. You could buy the parts in this period, but if you wanted to build a complete station, you had to assemble the parts yourself. And if you did do that, I think you had to dress the part. And it's a bit late for me now, given so many of these presentations. I did promise that I was going to dress up, not exactly like this, but, wear a bow tie and a dinner jacket or something. This is Gerald Marqueux's G2NM. But, all the stuff there, it might be commercial parts, but he's had to make everything. And it was different in America, as we'll see. But here in the UK, there wasn't a great deal of gear available. And if you look at this advert from a radio shop, which I didn't know about, it's actually just up the road from where I was born in Kent, down here in southeast London. In fact, I know that road very, very well, Widmore Road. But you look at this is from Shortwave magazine about 1936, when Shortwave magazine started. And you look at all those radios on the left, the Sky Buddy and this one, the RME. You look at these radios in this advert and it says, doesn't it, communication receivers. And it's a Southeast London company. So you think, well, there'd be some British ones in there, but you'd be wrong. They're all American. They're all American receivers. And I've got no real answer to why there weren't many UK communications receivers. Maybe in this country we're concentrating more on broadcast. There was one or two, but nothing like, the US was making all these different shortwave communication receivers, but we weren't. And there were questions asked in Shortwave Mag about where's the British manufacturers in communications receivers? Now, we didn't know the war was coming necessarily, and maybe the companies didn't know the war was coming. But as we'll see, once the war arrived, this lack of homegrown gear or home manufactured gear became a bit of a problem. Very few transmitters at all in that period before the war, 1935, 6, 7, 8. You could buy the odd one or two, but you're looking across the pond in the US, it was completely different. But here it's all the receivers that appeared. Eddystone, of course, a name that we'll mention again a bit later on, made a couple. This is one of them, just the ECR, the Eddystone Communications Receiver, 45 quid. That's not cheap, is it? You take that money from the mid-30s, and average wages, that was 1 or 2 months' wages, and maybe more, depending on what job you're in. So 45 quid was a lot of money. So whether they didn't think there was a market, or whether, whatever reason, we didn't get going with sort of general purpose communications receivers. World War II came along, as of course we're all familiar with, and around the world, in the Army, Navy and the Air Force, around the world, it was absolutely clear that unlike the First World War, where radio only played a minor part, this was going to be a war, the first sort of global war where technology was going to play a big part. and all the forces in the Axis powers and in the Allied powers in all the different countries involved all realised they had different radio requirements for the Army, the Navy and the Air Force. So the radio requirements and needs for the armed forces were very, very different, and the availability was going to become a problem. So the result of all of this was around the world that there was a massive production R&D, a ramp up of production capability, and what that became was a huge diversity of equipment as the world changed, and radio communication became absolutely central to the war and what came after. And a very large amount of kit. So of course, what that meant after immediately after the war, and nobody knew when it was going to end at the time, but after the war, was this gargantuan amount of kit that had been made around the world was suddenly perhaps not so useful anymore. A, it wasn't so useful because we weren't in a war situation anymore. And B, the pace of change meant the stuff developed early in war was out of date by the time it got to the end of the war. But there was lots of it. And of course, as some of you will know, this became what I've called the off-the-shelf surplus explosion, which immediately followed the Second World War and carried on actually for a long time, well into the late 60s even, because there was just so much stuff, and a lot of it had been mothballed or just stored, and a lot destroyed. And there's a phrase, this is a phrase that sort of appeared when this heavyweight military kit started to pop out for radio hams to get their hands on. And of course, you'll know what that phrase is. The word is boat anchor, and probably some of you have heard that word. And apologies if you all heard of it, but I'm not teaching you the techniques. But I wanted to know where it actually came from. I mean, we know what it means, but where did it come from? You know, and we'll talk about the receiver in a minute, weighs 100 pounds. And it came from CQ magazine in 1956, an American magazine, or the earliest reference I can find anyway, with this very, very cutting and rather unkind reply to a listener's letter, a reader's letter. I wonder if it was a reader or whether they made it up, but it says, the only conversion we can think of for converting wartime kit to amateur use is to tie 100 feet of line to it and use it for a boat anchor for your small boat. And I thought, that's really unkind, that, isn't it? But anyway, that's the etymology of the word boat anchor as it applies to radio hams. And I hope my wife comes to the door. I could just see the Amazon delivery man coming. She probably can't hear the doorbell, but I'm sure I'll leave it. Oh no, she's gone. Thank you. So there you go. If you know of the boat anchor used any earlier than that, then let me know. So what happened? All this different kit started to appear. Army kit, if we look at the individual ones, the 19, so it's probably the most famous Army radio for me of that boat anchor period of all time. Developed here in the UK finally in the Second World War, quickly went through Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3 from 1942. Could easily cover 160 and 80 and 40 meters AM, about 9 watts output. Huge numbers of it made, copied around the world, VFO controlled, transmit and receive. Made in absolutely huge numbers, very large numbers. It's nice. There's so much of this gear I haven't got time to go through. Just a little bit. I like this little, it's like miniature 19 set called the 62 set. Only runs 1 watt, this nice little portable set runs 1/4 of a watt. Not very portable when you think about it. And for Army radio gear, the amount and just the numbers just beggars belief, really, as it was quickly outdated and moved on. You could pick up a 19 set in the 60s. There it is. They're not exactly pocket money in for my parents. £4 10 shillings, £4.50, or I think at the bottom there you can have a slightly better one for £6 10 shillings, and they'll even unpack it for you and test it. And I think that's brand new in the box, and that's in the 60s. So considering that they were made, you know, into the war and just after the war, the numbers made must be run into the tens or hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands. And I haven't got time to cover this. This is a whole range of radios in itself that has come to be known in the VMARS, which is my the club, one of the big clubs that covers this gear, Vintage and Military Amateur Radio Society, and what is now been colloquially termed as green radio because it's green, or it became green. And there's just so much of this kit. And every time it went out of production in military, it turned up on the surplus market. So you've got Larkspur from the 50s to the 70s. I think this is Larkspur kit. Then it became Klansman, which I worked on when I was working in government communications in the 70s. At the moment, it's Bowman, which I don't think is available for radio hams. Will be, because it's frequency hopping and we probably can't use it. And the next generation is going to be called Morpheus. I'd think of the Matrix film, but hey, that's just the one. That's just what I think, and that's going to be the next generation. So each generation of this gear, it pops onto the surplus market, and certainly Klansman is now appearing in very large numbers. But it's a whole complete genre in itself. You can have a presentation just on green radio gear. There's some hams have just gone overboard on this, and they just absolutely love it. I don't so much, because it's much harder to repair and work on. It was designed, it's all hermetically sealed, much harder to work on, can be repaired, but a bit more specialist if we talk about buying gear and getting it going. Moving on to the Navy, first receiver that sort of appeared in the Navy was this thing called a CR100 or B28, very basic valve super het receiver, pretty heavyweight sort of thing, a real boat anchor. And it was superseded very quickly because it wasn't the best receiver to have on a battleship. And I learned a lot about comms on battleships through the war. But immediately after the war, this thing came out, the Admiralty B40, an absolute beast. Weighs, I think it's 114 pounds. I've got an advert for it, a real boat anchor, and of course a big turret tuner, clunk, 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 clunk on the right, fantastic shortwave receiver. And weight's not a problem on a ship, is it? So, you can have a battleship. I think the Belfast down here in London's got a whole row of them. Not a problem when you compare to all the other stuff they've got. And these things popped onto the surplus market. And the good thing about these is they outperformed anything else, cheap shortwave receivers you could buy. They were built to be good performers for AM and CW. So 60s radio hams, if they can persuade their parents to buy some of this kit, why wouldn't they? I knew people with these. Harder to repair because of their weight. In fact, for me, a lot of the problem with the really old kit is if you want to get inside it, you need to have big muscles, or there needs to be more than one of you. And here it is, £22.50, not as cheap as that 19 set I showed you in an earlier picture. Carriage 30 bob. Can you imagine the Amazon man or the DPD man delivering this thing? Weighs 114 pounds, over 100 weight. I know kids of my generation who live near me who had these in their bedrooms. God knows what their parents thought about the joists. But not cheap on the surplus market. That's quite a few £100 now to tap the parents up for when you were at school in the 60s. And of course nowadays people buy them. Historical collectors buy them, and they're big heavyweight things, but not something that's easy to repair. But if you get a working one, still a fantastic AM and CW receiver. Moving on to the Air Force stuff, probably the most famous is this one, the R1155, become very collectible now, a bit lighter and easy to repair. Came on the market very, very quickly. We'll just go back onto that. Came on the market very, very quickly after the war from 1947 because it was superseded, and loads of these appeared on the surplus market. Loads of kids had these, and they were quite cheap in the 60s, and they're quite easy to repair because they're relatively lightweight. And this is a classic installation, if you've ever seen it, of a Lancaster and other bombers in the war. The receivers at the bottom, the transmitters at the top. It's a T1154 transmitter. I know a few people with those. Just those coloured knobs go for a bloody fortune on eBay. So that's the sort of classic wartime bomber British gear bomber installation. The Americans had all sorts of gear in their aircraft, and some of that started to pop over here. These little things, I love them, called command sets. They're separate transmitters and receivers covering separate shortwave bands. So they're very, very special, just quite simple, lack of band switching. And I can remember seeing these around my friends' houses, and they're now highly collectible. And they came over here in quite large numbers, along with other American gear. And you look at this is an American bomber. You look at the amount of kit the flight the radio operator's got. It amazes me. The command sets are up there on the top right. Down the left-hand side, second from the bottom, you've got 1936 Ford ashtray. I don't know why it's in the picture, but it is. But you look at the amount of kit this guy's got to deal with, you know, compared to the British bomber. He's got long-range kit, which is that transmitter at the bottom called the ART-13 Collins. I haven't got time to talk about it. Phenomenal bit of kit, ran through the war and well beyond. And he's got the short-range kit at the top, the little command sets, and he's got a receiver there in the middle and a tuner. But he's got a load of stuff to play with, hasn't he? You know, he's got some real complicated stuff. So I bet he was knackered at the end of a bombing run. And during the war, our lack of homegrown shortwave receivers became a bit of a problem. I mean, we probably weren't to know, you know, I've read a lot of history books, but did we know what was coming when the war broke out and how much we would rely on listening stations to listen in on the German and Axis radio traffic? I don't know whether we did. We certainly didn't have the production capabilities. There was only one thing we could do. We had to lease, lend, buy from anybody that did make them. And top of the shop were the US, the Americans. And of course, this is my favorite boat anchor. I've had two of these in my radio ham life, 50 years. I've got one in one of my sheds now. Absolutely amazing electrical and mechanical performance you've ever played with one. Just spinning the dial and listening to the stations go by, just my childhood, just dream. I love the feel of it. Made something in the region of 25,000, staggering mechanics, weighs a ton. I repaired one a couple of years ago, just getting out of the case. It's a two-man job, but this is the classic wartime listening station receiver for me. And loads of these appeared. And they were used in all these listening stations called Y stations around the UK, listening in on Enigma Morse traffic, or what the Enigma code machine Morse traffic. Some listening stations had racks and racks of them, as you just a sample picture. And I do like to include a film clip in my presentations. And this is from Help, the Beatles film. And I was watching it for something else, and blow me down, there's a bloody AR-88 in the shop with George Harrison in front of it and Paul McCartney. So I couldn't believe it. So I love it. Film prop people love the AR-88 and a couple of other bits of kit we've shown. So in the see this in the 60s, mid 60s, can you see this? Brand new. I mean, how many did we lease them from America that we had in the 60s, you know, way after time? We still had them brand new in crates. God knows where they were stored. 75 quid. They did go up to 80, 87 guineas, I think, in 1970. And one of my mates bought one. With his first few wage packets, he must have saved up and tapped up his parents. 75 quid, lot of cash in 1967, 68, when I was 14, 15. Could not foresee that I'd own one of those. Next receiver is the HRO. Loads of these. Again, the listening stations were full of them. We had to get them from the US. A little bit easier to service and repair because the coils are plug-in. There's no band changing. Very popular with restorers today. Loads of variants of it. And great on AM. One of my mates thinks that listen to 80 meters AM, thinks these are just about one of the best. And you have to have a coil pack for each band, and you have to read off the graph to see what frequency you're on. So after the war, more interesting stuff started to appear that would eventually drop into radio ham shacks. And this beastie, the Raycall RA-17, is another one that's appearing a lot now, from 1955. Raycall were a small company in the early 50s, and they originally were going to build subcontractor receiver from the Collins company in America for a government contract for more modern communications receivers. We'll talk about Collins in a minute. Collins, two things stopped that happening. One is that Collins came over to the little Raycall factory in West London in the early 50s, and they thought, that's not good enough to assemble our kit. And the second thing is they insisted on a huge number of American components. and that just wouldn't wash. So effectively, they'd just be an assembly line, but they wouldn't do it anyway. Collins said no. So Rakel had to develop a receiver from scratch, and they fell in with this guy, Trevor Wadley, the Barlow Wadley loop. And if any of you have ever used an FRG7, it's the same type of topology for receivers. A drift cancelling topology. You set the megahertz with one knob, and then you go across that range with another knob to get from 0 to 1 every kilohertz, 0 to 1000. And this had this film strip dial which sets the kilohertz. So it's like a 35mm film strip with all the kilohertz marked on it. Very complicated mechanically, and again quite hard to repair because all the modules are sealed, and there's some good stories about this which we might cover at the end, but we haven't got time in the main presentation. But a lot of these are appearing now in ham shacks because they're just revered for some of their performance, quite good on SSB. And Rakel just carried on making better and better and improved receivers, mainly for government, and loads of them have turned up on the surplus market. Sadly, the company is all broken up now, but even the receivers from 20 years ago are fantastic, although complex with lots of chips in. But this valve version of this, and again, it's another film clip of the listening station here with RA17s in it. There's all the RA17s on the right. And you might think that's an interesting, how do we get a picture of a listening station back in the day? And of course, it's not a real listening station. It's from Dr. No, the film. So, see, I'm getting a bit hoarse. So it's from Dr. No, and apparently it's just the front panel. So whether they got a load of surplus ones in 1965 and chopped them up, I don't know. But already by the mid 60s, the RA17 was getting a bit long in the tooth. So we go post-war now, and this man pops up. Art Collins Radio W0CXX. Collins became one of the main defence contractors for radio kit in the Second World War in the US. Prior to the Second World War, he'd actually made ham radio kit for the American market. So the Americans had off-the-shelf ham radio kit, we didn't. So he absolutely phenomenal amount of production. Collins became this huge defence contractor, making this fantastic ham radio gear. After the war, he went back to making ham radio gear. This is one of his fantastic receivers, the 75A1 for the DX Hound. That's what the American adverts say. And he went for super quality. He didn't have a VFO. He had a thing called a PTO, permeability tuned oscillator, which is much better than a VFO, more stable, more linear, very accurate readout. Not many of these made it into the UK. By 1955, Collins realised that SSB was going to be the future of HF communications, and none of this AM. And he foresaw that both for ham radio and for commercial applications, if he moved quickly, he could be at the forefront. And he did. He demonstrated SSB to the American Strategic Air Command, and they immediately saw how much better than AM it was. And he swung into action to become yet again a huge contractor for the military. But he stuck with his ham radio roots as well, and made gear that also crossed over into the ham radio market. And these two amazing bits of kit, the 75A4 receiver on the left and the KWS1 transmitter on the right, became known as the Gold Dust twins because they are so rare and so revered. Actually, the transmitter on the right, let's just get rid of Gene for a minute. The transmitter on the right, that's only a bit of it. The power supply is in a cabinet, like 4 foot high. And that transmitter on the right, SSB transmitter, boat anchor style, in the 1957 shortwave mag was reviewed, and it was nearly £1,000 in 1957, 917 UK money. That is 30 grand. So how many radio hams had that money equivalent back in 1957 to buy that here? I doubt if many. There are a few in the country now. But around that time, this guy, G3ZPS, had a bit of an idea. He was a Collins employee, and he was looking at these two bits of kit in his garage, and he thought, oh, it's a bit I've got these two big bits of kit, a radio transmitter and a radio receiver. They've both got a VFO in them, or a PTO. They've both got a carrier oscillator in them for single sideband, because they're both, single sideband receiver and single sideband transmitter, or capable of. And they've both got a crystal oscillator that selects the band simplistically. So why do I need to have two of everything? Why couldn't I get a whole lot into one box? And he went and talked to Art Collins about it, and said he come up with this idea to get something with one knob in one box on. And Art Collins immediately saw that this was a quantum jump, and it was a transceiver, an SSB transceiver. Now, maybe it wasn't the absolute first one in the world, but it generally it's accepted to be one of the first, called the KWM1, and it's a transceiver. And he realized that military and amateur, the applications for it were, it's all in one box. And this was pretty much the first. If you look at it, only covers 20 meters to 10 meters. But he realized, and it became, there's one in the radio center at Bletchley Park, the RSGB. And here it is, even mobile. You couldn't use any other kit mobile. Now, I'm not sure it would have fitted into your Ford Anglia in 1957, but your big American motor it would have fitted in. And there is a view, an internet view, and I receive everything. I believe everything I read on the internet. There is an urban myth, or maybe it's more than that there was one on Gary Powers' spy plane, the U-2, when it was shot down over Russia in 1960 on a secret, I've got it written down here, on a secret CIA frequency. Is it true? I haven't got a clue. But there you go. So Art Collins, he knew that this was going to be a future change in comms. And they immediately upgraded to this thing called the KWM2/2A for amateur SSB transceiver, and they slimmed it down. They made it look 60s, the 50s and 60s. They changed the design. They made it look sexier. From 1959, made about 30,000 of these, and became sort of a benchmark for SSB transceivers very, very quickly. Professional quality, crosses over amateur and commercial, as I said there, but damned expensive, very expensive, all Collins gear expensive. So I hope to have one of these in the next few months. I've been offered two of them, but under COVID, I couldn't go and look at either of them. Collins quickly realized that there was a market now for this tabletop SSB transmitters in the ham community, lighter weight, not the big boat anchor separate boxes, slim it all down. And he quickly realized that he could make separate transmitters and receivers as well that matched. And it became a whole range of gear. Well, that's the inside, very well made, very, very, very revered quality. And he came up with this thing called the S-line. Now, the transceiver isn't actually part of it. The S-line's actually separate, but you look at it, it looks cool, doesn't it? And power supply on the left separately, made everything very light. And they just produced everything, and station controllers and all the whole thing that American radio hams had, this beautiful, sleek-looking gear that didn't look at all agricultural anymore. The big drawback with any Collins gear and all this gear was two big drawbacks. The biggest one is it's expensive now to buy and restore, and it's expensive because all the parts are expensive, unbelievable. Just a knob will cost a bloody fortune. I don't know why, but the rarity value, but it's different to a lot of the other gear in the next couple of slides. It's damned expensive. But super documentation, fantastic documentation, because it's he had the money coming in from military sales as well, and they set a quality benchmark and they stuck with it, and that stuck with them. It was going to be super quality gear. Another film clip. This is Doris Day, big fan of Doris Day, in a film called The Glass Bottom Boat, which is a spy spoof comedy film of the 60s. And she's using Collins gear, and her husband was a spy or something. If you see it on the television, it's a bit fluffy, but somehow or another, I think one of the production crew was a radio ham, or a stage screen husband was a ham, and he went to Collins and said, "Oh, we could put some of your gear in." And our Collins went, "Yeah, you can. There it is." And there it is again in a Hollywood film. So that's Collins. Now, some gear that's very close to my heart. Drake Company, and I'll try and race through this. Robert Drake, W-H-C-Y-E, here he is. Drake was another American guy who not had such a fantastic amount of work through the war. He tended to be working on smaller stuff. And after the war, he didn't have the wherewithal and the business coming in to grow the company, and they started to fall on the hard times. And one of the things that he realized was that he could do is he could make amateur gear, and he could make SSB amateur gear, a bit like Collins. He saw a gap in the market. So while he was off sick, he was ill because he was worried about the future of his little Drake radio company, because there's no work coming in. He designed a small, innovative little SSB receiver, SSB only initially, and he tried to get the big companies in America to make it and the one after it, but they didn't want to know. They had their big AM gear and everything, and they didn't want to know. So the answer was, you've got to build it yourself, and your company's going to have to build it. So sort of reluctantly, he started up as a ham radio. I mean, he made other stuff as well. They didn't move into the commercial arena. But he was going to have to build this stuff, this ham radio stuff himself. So he did. This is the first receiver he built, called the 1A. They say it's like a US mailbox because it's upright. Quite rare now. They only made a few thousand of them, I think. But he went to a couple of outlets and said, I'm going to make a low-cost SSB receiver. And they said, you make them, Robert, and we'll flog them because there's a market, and Collins is too expensive. And that's what he did. Quickly, it took off. And he started to make transceivers and receivers and transmitters. This is his classic transceiver called a TR4. I've got 4 of these, all the variants of these. And he started to make this, again, lightweight. That's the thing, lightweight, no power supply built in. Lightweight and compact. I've got one right here from 1963, good performance. And they discovered that they could use tubes from televisions called sweep tubes, which would do the horizontal deflection of TVs, colour TVs probably. And they'd actually work at RF rather than 15 kilohertz or whatever. They'd work at RF. And because there were so many televisions, there were so many of these tubes, they cost cents, just cents. And they actually worked up into HF, and they gobbled up current, so you get loads of power out of them. Still expensive here in the UK. But not as expensive as Collins. And they used a PTO, this thing called a PTO, which we weren't trying to go into, but more stable than a VFO, and I love them. I love this gear, cheaper than Collins. So that's a Drake TR4. And he, like Collins, he opened out into making separate receivers and transmitters. This is on my dining room table. It's called the 4-line, transmitter in the middle, receiver on the left. Join them together, they're a transceiver. You can use them as if they're both connected together, which is an innovation. They upgraded it later to a C line, and I've got a complete lineup of that as well. The only thing that let Drake down really is that between 1963 and 1977, 78, they didn't innovate much. They did innovate a bit, but a lot of the stuff, it looked pretty much the same as it did 15 years before. And the world was moving a bit quicker than Drake anticipated. But I love the gear. It's still pretty reasonably priced. There's been some on eBay that didn't sell this week. And it's relatively easy to repair. It's lightweight. The only downside, every rig's got a downside, is the sweep tube valves, which were favoured in this and a few other companies. There's no colour TVs with valves anymore. There hasn't been for decades. So the valves are now no longer available easily. You can get them, but they're expensive. So what was cheap is now expensive. And he had some premier customers, old Robert Drake. This is JY1, King Hussein of Jordan. You can see his Drake 4-line gear at the bottom left. He moved on to Drake, made another line of gear called the 7-line, which is quite, and from 1978. And he used that, but in this picture, he's got their 1960s gear. So then onto a company that I think Simon knows is very close to my heart, KW. I'm very near the factory here. I know the company very, very well. I have the history inside and backwards. I know the families, and I know a lot of employees. And the Cray Valley Club are very, very, very close to this company indeed. Rowley Shears, lived just up the road from here. I drove past his old house where he ended up every other day practically. G8KW. They had a very, very interesting wartime that's only just come out, what he did in the war. If you want to know, ask me at the end and I'll tell you a bit about it, just a couple of minutes, but I won't clog up the presentation with it now. Incredible man. The story, I'll give you a pen picture at the end. It's just staggering. I know his son very, very well, Richard. We'll see a picture of him in a minute. Rowley went into partnership with this guy briefly, Ken Ellis, G5KW, and it's just luck. KW, just their call signs. Rowley became DARC, Deutsche Amateur Radio Club member #1, and a lot of German hands. I go to Germany, or I did go to Germany before COVID every year to the big ham convention there, and a lot of the older DARC members know this. And the reason he's DARC member #1 is that after the war, he persuaded the American and the British governments in occupying Berlin that they should let radio hams come back on, because a lot of clandestine radio operation in 1946 or whatever it was, and Deutsche Amateur Radio Club reformed, and they made him member #1 because he championed it. So let's get these people back on the radio. Ken Ellis, you might think he's dressed a bit interesting, and he is. I can tell you why he got this. He did a bit of subcontract work in the 50s for the Saudi government and got awarded the Royal Rose and Dagger. I can tell you why at the end. It's incredible what these people did. So they started this little company. Ken Ellis fell away actually in the 50s, and they started in 1956, January 1956, making initially aerials and tuners and SWR bridges and filters for BBC TV in London. Stopped radio hams on 10 meters interfering with it, or 15 meters second harmonic or something. But they quickly started to make kits for AM radio gear, because again, there wasn't a lot of manufacturers. There were other manufacturers in the UK, but KW sort of got in quick, big adverts, good customer service, and started making this gear. This is one of their SSB transmitters called a Viceroy. I have all this gear. And it was in the 50s, it was in a boat anchor design. But they had a bit of an epiphany in the early 60s. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall. Oh, if somebody could invent me a time machine, please. And they looked across the pond at Collins and maybe Drake, and they thought, nobody in the UK is making a tabletop SSB radio for radio hams. And yet they're making them in America, but they're far too expensive over here. So why can't we make one? They must have thought like that. I didn't really know anybody that is still alive who was in the company at the time. And they sat around, and Rowley was great. He did this R&D, and they came up with this thing, and it's called Project 2000. And it's what became the KW 2000, which I've got 9 of them at the moment, I think, in Dartford here. And he came up using the same circuitry layout, topology, I'll call it, as Collins, but everything cheaper, every component, everything about it cheaper. So it looks the same in the block diagram, but everything about it is cut down. He couldn't use a PTO, so he's got a VFO. The readout isn't very good, and everything is cheap. And this is the actual prototype, because we found a photographer who lives not far from me here. I raided his archives, and we found this prototype. This is the KW 2000 prototype from mid-1963, an HF tabletop SSB transceiver made just down the road from me here. Called it Project 2000. Now it changed a bit when it went into production, but it's very similar to the Collins, very, very similar, but way, way cheaper. No CW, no capability for Morse code, no capability for AM whatsoever. Pretty poor dial readout, and it uses this mechanical filter dial, which Collins used, but Rowley couldn't afford Collins, so he bought a Japanese one. It's called a Kokusai mechanical filter instead of crystals. We'll talk about it in a minute. And it was a winner when it came out in 1963, the end of 63, beginning of 64. He showed it in the exhibition in London. It was an immediate winner because it was so much cheaper than anything else, and so innovative for its time. and it took off, and it quickly got upgraded through the 60s to the A, the B, and the E model by 1976. This is a classic one that's pretty much thought to be one of the best. This is my W2000B. It's sitting here on my shelf. I've got a very pristine example made in about 1970. And it had other innovations that the American gear didn't have. Good performance, not the best, quite good. A nice styling. Again, it looks nice on your kitchen table. It's not out of place there. It looks good on my kitchen table, doesn't it? Had 6146 proper transmit output valves. So Rowley went for that rather than the sweep tubes. Included top band. The American stuff, certainly the transceivers didn't have top band. And they didn't have RIT, so you could change the receiver a little bit to say somebody drifted, which they all do. Drake didn't have that. You had to buy the separates for that. But Festival was so much cheaper than US gear. And it's made 1 mile from me. And there's the factory, which I used to go and visit when I was 16-year-old radio ham, 17-year-old radio ham with my mate. I didn't live here then, but on a Saturday we would go and see Rowley and the team. And they were very kind to us kids. And we were kids, teenagers, we had no money. But and it stuck with me that they were so nice to us that I love the company and their products, even though they've been out now since 45 years. They've been gone. But I still know, if you've ever dealt with ICOM, Chris Ridley at ICOM, he was there at that time. He worked for Rowley. And they also developed a whole line, receivers and transmitters and linears. I've got everything on that page, the whole damn lot. And he quickly used this production capability and the fact that there was probably the tax situation here was very favourable, where the imports were expensive. The problem, every radio's got an Achilles heel when you come to restore it. The problem for KW is this bloody thing. It's the mechanical filter. And they haven't, they're a weak point. Here we are decades later, not at the time, but now. And the problem is that inside the little element that vibrates, it vibrates 450 kilohertz, not much higher than that. And those little discs are on different frequencies, and you get the pass band of the SSB, 2.1, 2.4 kilohertz. But the trouble is they were packed in that can inside in foam. And over the decades, that foam has degraded to a goo, and it clogs up the filter. And A, it takes it off frequency, and B, it allows the filter, the element to rattle around in the case and break or get damaged. So the Achilles heel with the radios is that it becomes like open heart surgery to repair these filters or replace them with a more modern one, which is not cheap. So that's the Achilles heel of repairing these radios. But apart from that, it's a few valves, capacitors and resistors, not much really. Still buy all the valves, they're not tremendously expensive. So I've no trouble restoring 13 complete stations, KW stations. Nasty capacitors, I'll show a picture of them, I hate them, they're made by Hunts, and they're just awful. They were even hated at the time. Craig Valley run a special event station every year in January, celebrating the company in our club shack just up the road here. I'm with my friend Guy, G0UKN, and we take a load of our kit, we put it in the scout hut, and we run GB8 KW every year in deference to G8KW. And that is G8KW. That is Rowley Shears, his son Richard Shears, who's a good friend of the club. And he's got G8KW, and he lets me and my friends use G8KW when he's in the room. So all those years after I was a kid going to the company, I've actually been on 80 meters as G8KW. And that was like, for me, that was a real thrill. So just a few other companies that we can't leave. Eddystone made some fantastic receivers all the way through in the 50s and the 60s. Had this slide rule dial that they sold to other manufacturers, but you could spin it and the pointer would zoom along, and it was so cool when you were a kid to see it. They made a huge number of receivers. The problem with them was that they made so many receivers and never settled on something to make a lot of money. And another commercial company said, "Oh, can we have one of these?" And they adapted it, new production, more money in R&D, and they made some fantastic receivers into the 70s. But sadly, the company went under. They're very well built. Watch out, some of the early ones are live chassis, no managed transformers. I've got a little one down my shed, which is off of a ship, AC/DC, nasty. Classic EA12 comms receiver. A little transistor receiver that was favoured by hams, called the Ian, but there were loads of others. And there's an Eddystone on the right and a KW on the left. In a film, yes, it's that film again, it's Dr. No. If you've ever seen it at the beginning, when the secretary of the Jamaican branch signals London, she's using KW and Eddystone kit. And this little thing, the Kodar, excuse me, I'm getting quite hoarse. Kodar 85 transmitter. If you're looking on a computer, the transmitter is smaller than what's on your screen. I've got two of them. They're highly collectible. Now, they're not particularly complicated, very simple, but they're all shoehorned into a nice little sort of shoebox style thing. And they really loved in the 60s for top band AM and 80 meters mobile, and had a little companion receiver, which I've got, which is crap. But they would fit in the dash lightweight stuff. Lovely little receiver. If you see them on eBay, they tend to go for a lot of money. And there was a kit revolution in the 50s and 60s for this outfit, Heathkit, massive company, absolutely enormous. This is their American Benton Harbor business, Heathkit. If any of you remember it, they made everything, musical kit, car, hi-fi, television, they had a kit for everything. Look at the Heathkit catalogue from the 60s. It's like the Argos catalogue, but twice the thickness. There used to have an Argos catalogue. Anyway, they moved into ham radio kit very quickly, initially with AM boat anchor kit, and then moved into sideband when they saw that everybody else was moving into it and that they could do it cheaper. And they came up with a line called the SB and the HW, which are Americans, of course. SB became Sugar Baker and HW became Hot Water. So, and I've got quite a lot of this gear. And they said it would always work as a kit, and it was cheap. This is their AM transmitter boat anchor, the DX100. This whole net's on 80 meters, just dedicated to this transmitter because it's a big doodah, AM transmitter, and does the business. Sounds fantastic. This is one of their Sugar Baker line. This is mine transceiver. Americans call it poor man's Collins. I don't. KW is poor man's Collins because that don't have the circuitry topology of a Collins, whereas KW kit I use does. But anyway, that's what the Americans call it. And quite good performance for a kit. And this is a Hot Water 101. I've got 2 or 3 of these. Again, only quite cheap in the early 70s, cheaper than buying something off the shelf. And the thing about Heathkits was the documentation was absolutely fantastic. I've got a load of these handbooks. Every single component, nut, bolt, screw, and washer and the technical descriptions of how the radio worked is phenomenal. I know complete idiots that will buy a Heathkit transceiver, go to the end of the book and disassemble it, if that's the right word, going backwards to the front, and then rebuild it going forwards with new screws, new washers, new nuts, new resistors, new capacitors, and then build the whole thing again, repaint the case. I mean, just complete nutters. So they make it like it was never made before. I love Heathkit gear. They made some great stuff. Restoring it, they used cheap components because it was a kit. They wanted to keep the price down. And the other problem with it is you are fighting 2 things: the basic design, which was not the best, but you're fighting that whoever built it originally, it might not have been that good with a soldering iron. So that's why a lot of people rebuild them. So pause for thought. We've got to the 60s, swinging 60s coming to an end. There's a whole load of companies that I haven't mentioned and others that you might know of, and I'm sorry I couldn't fit them all in. But these are the companies that Tom Withers down there at the bottom. I've got one of his radios. A great guy, British, and Hallicrafters and Hamelin and Swan in America, and we haven't had time to cover those. But things changed at the end of the 60s, driven by partly only a few people really. One of the key drivers was Salco JA1 MP, and of course he is the driving force, or was the driving force behind Yaesu JA1 MP. He died in 1993, sadly, and if you ever bought a radio with MP at the end of it, like an FT1000 MP or an FT5000 MP or the new FT101, whatever it is, MP, the only reason MP is stuck on the end of it is because he died in 1993 when Yaesu brought out their first FT1000, or very close to it. So when he died, they put MP on the end as a tribute to him, and they're still doing that now. So they started small and they grew very, very quickly. And the British and the Americans and others didn't really take a lot of notice because the kit was pretty similar to the stuff that was homegrown here and in America. It didn't look a lot different. And like every other company, Sarko came up with a tagline, FT. You know, we had SB, we've had KW, we had S-Line. He came up with FT, Fox Tango. It's lived as every radio ham around the world who's picked up a radio, FT 901, you name it, FT, Fox Tango. He came up with that. But the thing that set him apart from KW and Drake, specifically, not so much Collins, because Collins were in the military, is he innovated far quicker than they did. He didn't stand still. He quickly thought, I can improve it. I can come out with a Mark II. I can change it. I can improve it. He learned from his customers and from other companies that if he can move quicker, he can make a bigger impact in the market. The other thing he could do is the Japanese government probably wanting to get in with the technology, become a global leader. He was able to quickly build up a production capability that put the other companies to shame. And he was followed immediately, almost immediately, by Trio and Kenwood, who saw that a ham radio was a great way of getting in. And of course, Inouye, which became ICOM. And these big three started to drive ham radio very, very quickly, to the chagrin of the Americans and the British, who didn't really see it coming. And I guess if one radio epitomizes the rate of change, it's this one. I've got three of these. I think FT101, the first generation, came out in 1970. Beautifully made, plug-in boards. Not all of them are plug-in, but plug-in boards mostly. Very, 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 very high quality construction compared to some of the others. But the big thing about it was it had everything in it: AC power supply, DC power supply, noise blanker, clarifier if somebody drifted off frequency. All you needed was an aerial, a microphone, and a power supply or a battery, and you were on the air. You really didn't need sweep tubes again, so loads of power, heavy, but all in one box. And everything built in, good quality parts. The Fox Tango Club now really took off. The Americans started the Fox Tango Club and started talking to Sarko and his team about, oh, we've got some sprogs here, not very good on receive, Sarko. And the Yaesu went, oh, we can do some improvements here, and the Americans will buy more. And the numbers are just staggering. Is it 100,000? Is it 200,000? I'm not sure. But the number of this radio being built is just phenomenal. They just made so many. And they quickly then started to make lower cost, different, small radios, bigger ones, because they really, through the 60s and the early 70s, really took off. And this is a production line. You know, KW gear was made in a shed not far from me. This is a production line of Yaesu. It's just, there's a few pictures. You look at it, it's incredible. It's like an aircraft hangar, isn't it? And you can see that they meant global business. And the investment and the invasion came along pretty quickly. Yaesu moved quickly after the FT101 line. They upgraded it to the 101Z line. I've got three of these. Still sought after now, actually. All solid state became this new thing that Yaesu sort of were pretty much first in line with. Transistors everywhere, valves to transmit for the transmit power. The hybrid became a thing. Instant on, you don't have to wait for it to warm up to receive, and it's stable. When the receiver's good at switch on, good performance right up to 10 meters, but loads of power from the valves. Still everything built in, most of them, so heavy, but you didn't need to buy anything else. Digital readout. I've got a few of these, had some emails today from a guy, FT200, a simple valve radio, very good performer through the late 60s and into the 70s. The Americans rebadged it, called it the Henry Tempo 1, because they couldn't make anything that compared. Trio Kenwood started to make the TS line. The 830, highly revered now. People love them, and the gold versions of it. So thousands upon thousands of these. And their little cut price TS520 still sells well now. They just hoovered up. And KW, Drake and Swan and all the others, they didn't see it coming. They did not have the capability, which is a real shame. But these guys hoovered it up. And no more so than in 1977-78, Yaesu brought out this radio. I've got its brother, the 902. The difference is only that the walk bands are on one and not on the other. This radio's got actually everything built in. It's got a Kia, it's got proper AM, proper FM, proper filters, CW peak filter, make it even narrower. It's got a Kia built in. It's got a memory. It's got a tune-up timer. It's got a blanker. It's got a processor. Meanwhile, Drake is still making their TR4 valve transceiver in the same magazine, which they finally managed to get a clarifier tune control on it. But the noise blanker was extra and it cost a fortune. You can see that Drake were now 2 generations behind. KW had gone bust by this time. He'd given up. They just couldn't compete. Rowley knew that they were never going to be able to compete. He'd sold the company to Decca anyway, and it fell by the way. They just took over. I think there's a lot of us who have been around for a while would see coming. Icom dallied with valves in a hybrid design, but quickly threw them away and went straight to transistors all the way through. This is their first one, the Icom 701. I like some of these early Icons, but they went for size, small, and as a consequence, some of their early radios, the modules are packed in so tight, servicing or repair is an absolute nightmare, and I've steered clear of them. But you know, people love them. Small, lightweight, a big thing in the early mid to late 70s that you could get a 100-watt HF transmitter into a small box. And of course, Icom have just become a really, the performance of their radios has gone from strength to strength. And of course, what happened after this was all the companies just bought out model after model after model after model. And there are so many now that we haven't got time to think about them. And pretty much the end of the boat anchor, although some modern radios are very, very heavy, and some of us probably know if we've tried to lift them up. So moving to the last few slides, you know, why do we do anything with these? Some of this old kit, you know, why do we bother with it? Well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Is it memory lane? I can only talk from my experience and that of my friends. That's the teenage me. Well, it isn't the teenage me actually, but it might be the teenage some of us. Listening to the shortwave on the radio and dreaming about, you know, could I ever do anything? Would I better own anything of that, these magazines? So there's the teenage me having to think, you know, and I wanted a Fender Stratocaster guitar. I have actually got quite a collection of those guitars now because I'm a guitar player now. I wanted a sports car, and as it happens, you are the first and only radio club to know this. After 44 years, my red sports car is being delivered tomorrow. And no other club. Yeah, thanks, Simon. You've asked me what it is at the end. Would you believe it? I'd never realised that. Do you know, that's made my evening, that statement. I wanted to play all the Beatles songs and play like the Beatles, and I wanted the radios. So is it a thing that I go back? They say that you're 14, 15, 16-year-old, maybe in the male brain, is when you get fixated on something. You've got nothing before that. Everything is from then on, whereas, of course, as we get older, we go back to that time. It imprints itself so deep in our brain. You might disagree. I don't know. You're free to think what you like, but that's where I think it came from. You know, all we had was magazines and people, other kids to talk to. We don't want to speak to old men like me. So we all lusted after this kit that we couldn't afford. So maybe it's that. It's a Drake kit. Look at 225 quid. I couldn't afford that in 1971. I could go to the shops and look in the windows, or the shops in London where with surplus gear, at least that was affordable. You could buy components for a few quid, you know. But you could go and look in the other shops, and you could, like, I go to KW and I could just drool over it, but I couldn't afford it. So maybe that's why I've suddenly wanted to go back to it, or I don't know. What do you need to do it? Well, you need some skills, you need a commitment, and you need time. They're all tough things when you get older. Yeah, you can learn. Of course you can learn. If you've never done it, it runs in my blood. Not everybody. You can learn. And learning gets harder as you get older, but it's not impossible. You know, take it slow, and it never stops. You can carry on learning. Don't be frightened. Commitment is, you know, okay, you might get it wrong. You blow something up. I've blown things up, but you know, don't run off in despair and thinking that it's never going to work. You know, take a break, come back to it. Probably time is one of the really difficult ones, isn't it? It's the hardest. maybe not in this last year, and we've all been locked down, but I speak to people on the radio and they say, oh, I've got an FT200 in the loft. And I say, well, get it out, you know. Well, if you're not going to do anything, flog it, give it to me, and I'll flog it, or I'll give you some money for it. But we're terrible hoarders, and sometimes with things that we think we're going to repair and we don't. So commitment and time, you know, especially in the 21st century, for when we've all got busy lives, it is a hard thing. So I realise that, of course. I'm just having a bit of a laugh here. So if you're repairing HF gear, you don't need a great deal. This is my garden studio. You know, I've got basic test kit like you know, a bit of room, a scope, a digital multimeter, another receiver to listen on, and a dummy load, all those things that most radio hands or anybody, you know, partly anybody involved in any sort of basic engineering would have, but they're not expensive things to buy. Cheap scope that covers the HF bands. I reckon I could tell a receiver's working just by plugging an aerial in anyway. If I near the station's on 10 meters, not near the noise, then it's working. So, you know, I don't use a lot of test gear really a lot of the time. And you know, where you're going to buy this stuff? Well, sadly, during the lockdown, it's probably been eBay, and a few other shops have been, you know, where we buy some of this kit from. Pre COVID times, I would say the best thing to do was to buy radios and get them from your friends. You know, you don't have to bid on them. You can do a deal. You might be able to do a swap. Friends, networks, and colleagues. I've got stuff from around Europe actually that's been sent to me through my Facebook and ham radio pages. People have just sent me stuff. Incredible, but it's all about networking. The more networking you do, the more somebody or silent key sales. But even if you went for a bidding war on eBay, it becomes a pain, doesn't it? And these things, of course, I love. And maybe some of us, maybe you do as well, radio rallies. Now, when are they going to come back? We're not absolutely sure, but you know, this year there are 1 or 2 boot sale radio rallies here in the southeast for August, September. I don't know whether they'll take off or not, but you can go and touch and feel it, don't you? I normally assume things aren't going to work and say, look, it's junk. But you know, I might be able to get it working, because you don't know until you open up something what you find inside of it. And price and performance, but price mainly. If it's not working and it don't, you know, it looks reasonable, but you don't know anything about it, it's going to have to be cheap, isn't it? And research these days is incredible. Loads of manuals and stuff's on the internet. If you don't get one with a bit of kit, it's all on the internet. Just about every manual for every bit of kit with every circuit diagrams on the internet. VMARS, Vintage and Military Amateur Radio Society, they've got hundreds of members, got a website with loads of documentation on it. I'd love it or hate it. I know some people do hate it. Forums and internet groups, you have to be selective. I make them work for me. I try not to get sucked into them. But you know, I'm in a KW and a Drake and a Yaesu group. Sometimes I mute them because there's so many stupid questions. My radio's stopped working. What's the problem? And then somebody says, I haven't got one, but have you tightened up all the screws and changed all the capacitors? You're completely and utterly useless advice. But they're there, and social media. I use it, and I've benefited in my ham radio restoration fund life from this stuff. So the key things when you get old gear is all the mechanical things are going to probably have problems with them. So I never even turn them on. You know, switches and oxidized relays or oxidized pots and switches are going to be noisy, and I clean them all before I even start. Resistors and most valve gear, you can test resistors with it all plugged, you know, if you unplug anything, unplug from the mains, but you can just test them in circuit, and it will be high, but maybe not vastly so. There are 20% tolerance in loads of valve gear. Capacitors, well, there are some makes that you would change immediately. Electrolytic capacitors, well, there's a whole presentation on those. Some of the higher voltage ones I normally do change, but some of the lower voltage ones, if they look all right and the radio's working, I don't change. And some radios don't have a huge number of electrolytic capacitors in them. I normally do change the power supply ones, but not in every case. But again, as you do more, you get more experience. Valves, they're remarkably long-lived. They go on forever, and almost seems to me not forever and ever, but they do go on for a very long time. And I've had very few faults. These things, the 3-legged transistors, they do clap out. They do fail. Chips and transistors do go wrong. They have not got an unlimited life. And these bigger chips, if you have to change them when you're into a whole new ball game, and that's why I don't do so many radios with the processors and synthesizers in, because the faults can get really, really deep. So and then I don't class it as old ham radio kit. Why do we bother? You can get creative with the painting. I paint my KW gear up with period correct colors. I've learned how to do it, rub down, primers, top coats, and I've become quite good at it. But I was crap at the beginning. And this is typical of a radio that I've restored that I was given from a friend of mine, KW2000A. The front panels are the worst. If they're really beaten up, you really are in trouble, because it's very difficult to do a front panel. This one's got some extra lettering on it, and I've left it, but apart from a few marks, repainted case, new screws, refurbished inside, it looks and works great. So, I mean, really important, of course, is a safety check, and double check safety first. You cannot emphasize that too much in valve gear. I mean, you can do a lot of damage with transistor gear. You've got 22 amps from your power supply, and you short it out, it could be a big bang. What are the pitfalls as we get to the last couple of slides here? The biggest pitfall for me is a man called the bodger. My friends, my ham radio friends, are well acquainted, because I've been calling this person Mr. Ham Radio Bodger for a long time. And Mr. Ham Radio Bodger appears to be a certain class of amateur, possibly an older amateur, from the 60s and the 70s, who passed the RAE and then believed and it probably was he was a top flight engineer, and it wasn't. And then started set about with his pipe. That's how I imagine him. I know it's not right, sorry. Puffing away, and I modified this perfectly fine bit of commercial equipment. And boy, have I seen some horror stories. These people should have never been allowed near a soldering iron. That's not part of the RAE, was it? Never has been. I know this construction's been here, but you know what I mean. Shouldn't have been let near a spray can or an electric drill. And I have seen some horror stories. Just a new one this week. I changed the power supply, the code R85 power supply stopped working. And I kid you not, the mains lead was a piece of coax. The live was the center and the neutral was the braid, and I couldn't tell because each end, of course, was hidden from me, but it shorted out on one end. Could you believe it? And this is the sort of thing they get up to. This is from a radio that I restored, putting extra bits and old radios inside perfectly good modern radios. And this soldering of a relay sticking out the bottom of a swan. These people should have been just been left with a black box to operate. So this is the last slide now. What do we get out of it in the end? So this is the very last slide, and thanks for listening. What do we get out of it? Well, what do I get out of it? Well, I've done this presentation a lot now. I don't know, 15, 20 times. I think 15 times this year. And a few people have said, is it fun? Do you really get fun out of it? Well, yeah, I get fun out of it. Somebody else might want to run away screaming and head for the whiskey. I don't know, but I get fun out of it. Actually, I do run away screaming sometimes when I can't find a fault. But it's me versus that machine and the people who designed it and maybe the people who modified it. And I want to get it back to where it was. I can't describe it any other way. And for me, it's a challenge and achievement. I wasn't good at it at the beginning. 20 years ago when I started on the Drakes, I wasn't good at it then. I was drawing on my childhood experience, but there's a lot of learning to do. So I've learned a lot now, and I can diagnose them even over the internet now on YouTube videos. And let's face it, a lot of these modes haven't changed much. I love it when they say a modern radio brand spanking new is all modes. Well, they're not new modes, are they? SSB 60 years old, AM 20s, CW 100 years old, more. RTTY has been around since God knows when. So none of these modes are they're not new, are they? So all these radios, but they'll have foibles, but they work on all those modes, so they haven't changed. They actually work quite well. Some of the Drakes, they've got no menus. My friend, when he worked somebody with an Icon 70 something doodah, he says, I've never found a hidden menu or the audio tone control for all the EQ and transmit, because people, when I have a contact, they say, what are you using? I say, I've got a microphone plugged into a radio and that's it. So there's no menus. They actually work quite well. And for me, and I can't speak about other people, it's a social history. I know the people that made this stuff. I've met people. I know I've met on the radio. I've met people who work for Drake. I've talked to them on the telephone and on the internet, and the people who've taken a love to understand about how they were built, how they were designed, and the way they work. So social history for me, and the people who bought them, and my own view of being around at the time means that I just love doing it, and I can't put it any other way. So the very last picture on here is it a bit like having an old car where this will get you, this Morris Minor will get you to Tesco's as well as your Tesla. Well, hopefully it'll get you back as well as your Tesla. Maybe your Tesla ran out of batteries, but of course, when you get into Tesla, you have to turn the key, you just get in and press a button and it moves, doesn't it? And it comes back. But in the Morris Minor, you've got to fettle the choke, you get the engine running smoothly, let it warm up, and maybe it's got no synchro and all. So is it men, mainly men, I don't know, who love the old tinkering thing with an old car and keeping it going? There's a big classic car thing. You go to classic car things around the UK. There's loads of rallies and there's loads of nerds with classic cars. And isn't it like that with me with radios? There's a tinkering, keep it on frequency, tweak the pre-selector, set the bias right. Is it that man thing? I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. I've asked loads of people. I've got one in a couple of weeks for the big American club, but I've got to give it bloody midnight, and I'll ask them. I'd be very interested to know what they think. Thank you very much, Simon, Danny, and the rest of the club members there. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll unshare. I will just before I unshare. If you want to find me, G3ZPS.com, G3ZPS Ham Radio on Facebook, VMARS there, Telecaster Steve's on my YouTube channel, and Crane Valley Radio Society has just come up to its 75th anniversary, and I always give them a plug. So there you go. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. I'm sure Daniel will chip in.
Well, I found that very interesting because I've got quite a few boat anchors here, as they call them. There's various Eddistones here in various states of repair, or I haven't looked at them. I've even got an R107 here.
Yeah.
She's sat on a stool and it's been there for about 18 months. I cannot move it myself.
That's the problem, Danny.
Yeah, that is the problem. I don't know where to start with it, but I haven't even got a plug for it actually. I'm looking for one of them, but yeah, I've got
the Eddystone plug.
Yeah, no, the plug for the R107. It's like an old flat iron one or something.
Is it a Jones plug? Is it the old Jones plug?
No, it's only got two prongs that stick out.
Oh.
But I seem to remember they had one on an old flat iron donkeys years ago.
Yeah, you have to see it to know what it looks like. If you've never seen one, you can describe it and get the size completely wrong.
Yeah, there is a bloke in the next village actually who's got one of those sets, and he's got a plug, and I'm just trying to wangle it out of him to borrow it. But there we are. I've also got a Heath kit here, a Mohican.
Oh, right, a receiver,
yeah. I actually built that myself.
Yeah.
I think it needs a few capacitors in it now, but it does work. It's very, very weak, but I'll have a go at it one day,
I think it's got germanium transistors in it.
Yes, it has, yeah.
And I think they tended to grow whiskers inside, and before anybody knew what transistors, how long they would live, and they've got failure modes, them old germanium transistors, the AF117s that are in the Mohican, I think. But again,
if I get some, I'll do a bit of reverse engineering.
Yeah, there's tricks.
I found that very interesting. Anybody here got any questions you want to ask Steve?
I'd like to thank Steve for taking me down memory lane.
No, I didn't realise that, Stan.
It was brilliant. I remember I've got one of those mechanical filters somewhere. I remember the Hunt's capacitors that kept cracking. I've been through the post-war thing with the 1155 CR100 and all the rest of it, but I've always tended to build my kit until quite recently, because I'm getting, I don't know if it's age or what, but it was really interesting. And I thought, you were talking about the development of radio pre-war, Second World War, and how far America was ahead in many respects compared to the UK. And you know what I put it down to? I put it down to the dead hand of the GPO and the fact in America, of course, we're talking about far greater distances. And
Yeah.
I think that's a lot to do with it because you know the kind of regulations that we had to satisfy here. I think America was much more lax. And of course, they have greater distances. And I attribute